Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a rapidly escalating domestic crisis building inside Russia. Experts are calling this a highly compressed version of the Afghan syndrome. And by looking closely at official data and independent reporting, we're going to compare the Afghan syndrome versus today. We're going to uncover exactly what happens when a state arms its prison population, sends them to the front lines, and then brings them right back home. It's a fascinating, deeply concerning dynamic, so let's get right into it.
Let's kick things off with a viral video that surfaced just last month. It was filmed by a 39-year-old Russian war veteran. And in this video, which was viewed millions of times by the way, he didn't just complain. He explicitly threatened the Kremlin, warning that soldiers would turn their weapons against the state unless President Putin personally met with him about the abuse of troops by their commanders. It was incredibly brazen.
Now, you'd probably expect a massive crackdown in response to a direct public threat against the Kremlin by a trained soldier, right? Well, the Russian court's actual response was bafflingly light. They sealed the case file, handed down a minor charge, and gave him exactly 11 days in a cell. 11 days for threatening the state. This raises a massive question. Why on earth is the government treating a threat like this with kid gloves?
That brings us to Section 1, an army of convicts, and how this crisis is being built.
That 11-day sentence? Totally not a fluke. To understand why, we really have to look at the numbers. Since the summer of 2022, Russia took the unprecedented step of recruiting directly from its prisons. We are talking about pardoning convicted criminals in direct exchange for their military service. Estimates drawn from our sources suggest a staggering pipeline of up to 180,000 convicts have been pulled straight from their cells and sent to the front.
And here is the harsh reality of that policy. Every single one of these guys, including severe, violent offenders, eventually arrives home. But they don't come back on parole. They arrive as fully pardoned, legal citizens who've just spent months being trained to kill without hesitation. Legally speaking, their slate is wiped entirely clean.
Section 2, the war comes home. Let's look at what happens when these veterans return.
Finding the truth about what happens when these newly pardoned veterans return to Russian streets takes some serious digging. Mostly because Russian military courts have effectively stopped publishing their rulings. But independent, exiled journalists have meticulously tracked the domestic fallout. Through piecing together local reports, they found that over 1,000 people have been killed or injured inside Russia by returning veterans since the invasion began. Over 1,000 victims in communities that thought they were miles away from the front line.
But honestly, the most terrifying part isn't just the total number, it's the velocity. Out of those casualties, there have been at least 551 recorded deaths, and the rate of these violent incidents has roughly doubled in just the last 10 months alone. The crisis isn't just ongoing, it is accelerating incredibly fast as more combatants return.
Now, it's crucial to understand who exactly is committing these new crimes. Nearly half of the pardoned veterans who went on to kill or maim civilians back home already had prior violent convictions before the war ever started. The state essentially armed known repeat offenders, handed them a pardon, and then dropped them right back into the exact same neighborhoods they had previously victimized.
Moving to Section 3, Justice Discount. How medals literally buy leniency.
This has created a staggering two-tiered justice system in Russian courtrooms right now. A civilian facing domestic violence charges gets standard prosecution. But a veteran? They frequently receive a mere $55 fine. $55! That is a rounding error compared to a combat bonus. For violent offenses, courts are systematically citing military merit to reduce sentences. A veteran's uniform literally buys a massive discount on justice.
And even within the Russian government, the alarm bells are starting to ring quietly. An Interior Ministry scholar formally warned officials to expect a continuing surge in violent crime. Why? Well, it's a toxic mix of untreated trauma, heavy alcohol abuse, deeply ingrained familiarity with weapons, and severe economic desperation. Right now, there are roughly 250,000 unemployed veterans in Russia, and there is absolutely no large-scale reintegration or psychological support system waiting for them.
Section 4, the Afghan syndrome. Let's look at the historical echo. To truly grasp the gravity of this situation and where it might lead, we actually have to zoom out to the 1980s. Historians use the term Afghan syndrome to describe the profound social erosion, the waves of untreated trauma, addiction, and rampant gang violence brought home by Soviet soldiers returning from the 10-year Afghan war. The state had zero framework to handle them,
And this syndrome contributed heavily to the mounting internal pressures that ultimately eroded the entire Soviet system before its collapse in 1991.
When we compare the Afghan syndrome versus today, the compression of time is absolutely staggering. The Soviet Union's Afghan crisis took a full decade, from 1979 to 1989, to unfold. Today's crisis in Russia has reached a boiling point in just 18 months. It really puts into perspective just how much faster and more intense the modern situation is compared to history.
And the scale of the trauma, it's on a completely different level. Over 10 years in Afghanistan, the Soviets lost roughly 15,000 soldiers. But in just the first 18 months of the current conflict in Ukraine, Russia suffered over 33,000 dead. That is more than double the casualties in a fraction of the time, resulting in a massively accelerated wave of traumatized, hardened survivors returning to a society that just isn't ready for them.
Section 5. Aimed at the Kremlin. An undeniable threat.
When you mix these staggering casualties with a cohort of protected violent offenders, the state is realizing it cannot control this demographic. A highly publicized program designed to reward veterans with 150 parliamentary seats has quietly collapsed, slashed down to just 30 seats. Behind closed doors, officials admit they view these veteran candidates as completely non-systemic, meaning they are too unpredictable, too hardened, and simply too dangerous to integrate into the government machine.
So, let's pull all these threads together. Russia has essentially built an army out of men trained for extreme violence. It's sent them home with shiny medals and court-ordered legal immunity, but ultimately it's given them the cold shoulder. They are locked out of power and offered zero systemic support for their trauma or unemployment. It is a perfect recipe for domestic instability.
Which leaves us with this final, critical thought to end our explainer on. Russia built a machine trained to kill and gave it absolutely nothing to come home to. That 39-year-old soldier we talked about at the very beginning, the one who publicly threatened the Kremlin online, he wasn't a fluke. He was the machine, finally aiming back at its creator. The question now is, how long until the rest of that machine does exactly the same? Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep questioning the headlines.